Hello, welcome everyone to another video podcast on neuroanatomy. You probably know by now that the CNS comprises of two main parts, the brain and the spinal cord. Now, these are important control centers of our body, so they have to be housed in protective bony regions. The spinal cord is resting inside the vertebral canal, whereas the brain rests inside the cranial cavity. The aim of this video is basically to help you understand how the brain fits into the cranial cavity. So let's get started. All right, so as a first step, we basically start with orientating the prosection. So what you can see over here is basically a picture of the cranial cavity. The vault of the skull or the cap of the skull has been removed, and you can see the base of the cranial cavity from inside over here. And you can probably appreciate that the cranial cavity has kind of three step regions to it, three sub-regions to it, which are known as the cranial fossae. So let's just quickly demarcate the boundaries of these three fossae, and then we'll talk about those in a bit more detail later in the video. We can see the anterior cranial fossa over here, right? This is the posterior extent of the anterior cranial fossa. Then behind that, we can see this butterfly-shaped region over here, which is the middle cranial fossa. Different parts of the brain are going to rest into this fossa over here, and we'll talk about that in detail as well. And then behind the middle cranial fossa, we can see this is the extent of the posterior cranial fossa, which is lowest in terms of its vertical orientation. This is basically highest. The anterior cranial fossa is the most highest situated region of the cranial cavity. Then comes the middle cranial fossa, and if we go one step down, this is the posterior cranial fossa. Right, so then if you look over here at the right, we're basically looking at a prosection of the brain. We're looking at the base of the brain. You can see the frontal or the front end of the brain over here. The back end of the brain is here, characterized by the cerebellum, and then the brainstem continuing down as the spinal cord. Right, so now this base of the brain is going to fit into the cranial cavity. We can see the frontal lobes over here. This is basically the undersurface of the frontal lobe you're looking at. So these are the orbital gyri on the undersurface of the frontal lobe. And so this is this is the orbital surface of the frontal lobe. And this region is basically going to fit into this anterior cranial fossa over here. You can see that this sharp margin at the back over here, this is the posterior extent of the anterior cranial fossa. It's basically a part of a bone which is known as the sphenoid bone. Now we're not going to be talking about the bone in detail. We will come to that maybe in a video on the cranial, maybe in a video on the anatomy of the skull. But for now, what you have to know is that, see, this is a bone called the sphenoid. It has a body to it, and then it has two wings popping out of it. This is the sharper, lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, and then the greater wing can be seen down below over here. The sharp edge of the lesser wing of sphenoid bone actually forms the posterior extent of anterior cranial fossa. The frontal lobes, as we discussed, are going to rest on the orbital plates of the frontal bone. These are the orbital plates of frontal bone because they're actually forming the roof of the orbital cavity. Orbital cavity just lies underneath it. Remember, we're looking at the cranial cavity from the top, right? The lesser wing of the sphenoid bone is gonna fit into this region over here. This is basically the lateral sulcus, or the region where the stem of the lateral sulcus is going to reside, and that stem of lateral sulcus separates the frontal lobe in the front from the temporal lobe at the back. So the lesser wing is nicely going to fit into this region over here, and once again providing a little bit of a support to the brain, providing stability to it. Right, then we go back from over here from the anterior cranial fossa into this region, into this butterfly shaped region, which is the middle cranial fossa. The middle cranial fossa is bounded anteriorly is limited anteriorly by this lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, and then posteriorly you can see this ridgy bony area over here. This is known as the Petrus part, or the Petrus part of the temporal bone. It's a subpart of a bone called the temporal bone, and this is known as the Petrus bone. The Petrus bone has a sharp margin at its top. This is basically the posterior extent of the middle cranial fossa. So this region here is the middle cranial fossa, and over here as well. The temporal lobes of the brain, which you can see from below here, they are going to rest into the middle cranial fossa. The middle cranial fossa is formed of several bones. Some of the main bones could be the greater wing of the sphenoid, which we just talked about before as well. We said that the sphenoid bone has a body with a lesser wing popping out of it and a greater wing here. The greater wing is part of the middle cranial fossa. And then we can see this region here. This is basically the temporal bone, and it extends behind over here, forming the petrous part of the temporal bone. And so maybe there's a bit of parietal bone at the side over here as well. So these are the bones which are mainly forming the floor of middle cranial fossa and housing the temporal lobe of the brain. Then if we go to the back over here, this entire region is formed mainly by the occipital bone, and this is actually part of the posterior cranial fossa. Now, a common misconception is that the occipital lobes of the brain are going to sit into the posterior cranial fossa, but that is not exactly true, because we can see the posterior cranial fossa is quite way down below in terms of its vertical orientation. So this region, the cerebellum, which is at the back of the brain, that is going to fill into this space over here. That's going to fit into the posterior cranial fossa. And the brain stem, which you can see at the base of the brain here, you can see, the midbrain might not be that prominent, but at least the pons and the medulla are clearly seen here, continuing down as the spinal cord. This brain stem is basically going to rest against this bony region here, which is known as the clivus. It's actually formed partly by the occipital bone and partly by the back of the body of sphenoid bone, and the brainstem is resting here, and then you can imagine it continues down as the spinal cord as it exits through the foramen magnum inside the occipital bone or inside the posterior cranial fossa. Right, so that's a brief summary of how the brain fits into the cranial cavity. The frontal lobes primarily in the anterior cranial fossa, temporal lobes in the middle cranial fossa, with the cerebellum and brainstem in the posterior cranial fossa, and the occipital lobes are then going to be higher up. So they're inside the cranial cavity, but they're not inside in any of the fossae. Right. Lastly, I just would like to highlight one point over here. See, if you look at the base of the brain, you can see different cranial nerves coming off from the base of the brain. For instance, we can see the cranial nerve number 1 over here. We'll talk about those nerves in detail in some later video as well, but I just want to highlight one important fact over here. See, this is the first cranial nerve, then we can see the second cranial nerve, the third cranial nerve, and you can see all those nerves popping off from the base of the brain. These are 12 pairs of cranial nerves which come off from the base of the brain. And the good thing, and this is what I wanted to actually mention here, is that all these cranial nerves, they actually come out from the base of the brain in a sequence. So we'll start with cranial nerve number 1 over here, which is the olfactory nerve, and then we make our way back in a sequence ending at the cranial nerve number 12 somewhere over here, which is the hypoglossal nerve. So it's really easy to remember those nerves because they're all present in a sequence. And then corresponding to these nerves, we can see different foramina in the base of the cranial cavity all along. These are the foramina for the cranial nerves. So the cranial nerves are going to exit, they're going to pop out from the base of the brain, but then they're going to exit through these foramina and become extracranial. Once they become extracranial, they're going to supply, innervate different structures. So we'll talk about the details of the cranial nerves and their innervation in detail in later videos. So to summarize, in this video we basically talked about the cranial cavity. We saw how the base of the brain looks like, and we discussed in detail as to how the base of the brain is going to fit into the cranial cavity. Thank you very much.